Hello there! My name is Siobhan Eve and welcome to my channel. This is my first video, but I'm planning on making more videos about other topics that interest me. In general, I plan to make videos about film, literature, psychology, and philosophy, so please subscribe if that sounds interesting to you. I also recently started a website called Lit Philo, where I publish similar content, so please check that out and subscribe for updates to my blog as well. Let's get into it. Today we're talking about warfare. Introduction: War is hell. War is hell. This quote is often attributed to General William Tecumseh Sherman of the U.S. Army during the Civil War. Now, I can't speak on how groundbreaking this statement was to the general public nearly 200 years ago, but today it has become so ubiquitous that it risks meaning nothing. It's pretty vague, free of politics or any particular ideology, and to me at least, it seems to remove responsibility from any specific person, country, or action. The phrase war is hell seems to portray war as something inevitable, as if it exists because of some inexorable evil, rather than being the result of man-made decisions. In our current cultural moment, it often functions as a way to acknowledge suffering without assigning blame. Hell, even J.D. Vance uttered this statement recently when asked about the genocide in Palestine on Theo Vaughn's podcast.
Do I think it's a genocide? No. And here's the reason why I don't think it's a genocide, because I don't think that the Israelis are purposely trying to go in and murder every Palestinian. I don't think that's what they're doing. I think they got hit hard, and I think they're trying to sort of destroy this terrorist organization, and war is hell, and that is true.
That kind of rhetoric where politicians brush aside war crimes with a broad generalization about how terrible war is makes the quote feel empty to me. And frankly, as a general rule, I never want to be on the same side of history as J.D. Vance. As someone deep on KitCon or Twitter for professional reasons, obviously, I've seen endless discourse around Warfare, the 2025 film directed by Alex Garland. I want to avoid the kind of absolute statements I've seen online, such as claims that the film is pure military propaganda or that it's the most accurate depiction of war ever put on screen, because I think the truth is more complicated. I had my own moral hesitations about seeing it in theaters, especially since it wasn't marketed as explicitly anti-war, so I wasn't surprised by the backlash, particularly from younger, left-leaning audiences who were drawn to it by the A24 label and the involvement of a few current white boys of the month. While watching this film, it's hard not to think of the phrase, war is hell. Let's get into why. Content warning for intense war violence, realistic combat situations, and bloody/gory images. Also, spoiler warning, I'm going to spoil major aspects of the film during this review, so please be advised. But if you've already seen the film or just want to hear a breakdown of it and see what all the discourse is about, let's get into it. Chapter 1, Plot and Style, Stripped Down Realism. Warfare is based on a real mission that took place in November 2006 in the Ramadi province of Iraq, which was under al-Qaeda control at the time. The film follows a group of American Navy SEALs who are conducting surveillance in a residential area to confirm whether ground troops can safely pass through the next day. The SEALs seize the apartment of an Iraqi family, and most of the film unfolds within this space. When al-Qaeda forces hurl a grenade into the apartment, one SEAL, Elliot Miller, is gravely injured, and the team prepares to evacuate. Before the SEALs leave, they send two Iraqi soldiers who had been working with their unit as translators ahead as a test to see if the path is clear. Once it seems safe, the SEALs follow, only to be hit by an improvised explosive device, an IED, that instantly kills one Iraqi soldier and severely injures Miller and another SEAL. The rest of the film focuses on the SEALs' desperate struggle to keep their two wounded comrades alive until backup arrives. All the American SEALs survive, but Elliot Miller sustains lasting brain damage as well as loss of his legs. The film closes with the Iraqi family emerging from hiding and emotionally reuniting inside their home. In the final scene, the camera lingers on the now quiet street as smoke clears and locals cautiously emerge from their houses to reconvene in the streets. Stylistically, Warfare is quite subversive. There's no score, the sound design is immersive and overwhelming, and the film deliberately avoids many of the conventions typical of war films. The absence of music leaves viewers without emotional cues, and the intense audio places them squarely in the chaos alongside the SEALs. These formal choices are some of the film's greatest strengths, but beyond its style, Warfare is less subversive than many viewers expected. To be fair, the film was never explicitly marketed as anti-war. Still, its association with A24 and writer-director Alex Garland led some fans to hope for something more critical or revolutionary in its depiction of war. What we got instead is closer to a meticulous reenactment of memory. Chapter 2, Historical Context, the Iraq War in brief. If you're not fully familiar with the general disinformation that surrounded the Iraq War, that's okay. However, to understand what warfare represents, context matters. So here is a very brief introduction to the American disinformation campaign that ultimately resulted in the Iraq War. The Iraq War officially lasted from 2003 to 2011, and it began with a US-led invasion intended to overthrow Saddam Hussein. Following the September 11th attacks, the US government spread misinformation that capitalized on the fear of the general American public. Bruce Riedel, a member of the National Security Council at the time, later explained, the Bush administration was eager to mobilize the anguish of the 9/11 attack to support the war. Despite the intelligence community's unequivocal conclusion that Iraq had nothing to do with either 9/11 or al-Qaeda, the administration let Americans believe the contrary. Consequently, the United States went to war in Iraq on a false pretense that it was somehow avenging those killed by al-Qaeda. A Washington Post poll conducted 2 years after 9/11 dramatically illustrated the story. 69% of Americans at the time believed Saddam Hussein was personally involved in the 9/11 attack. Even more staggering, 82% believed Saddam provided assistance to Osama bin Laden. Both were utterly false. According to Britannica, Vice President Dick Cheney, in particular, played a central controversial role in conveying intelligence reports that Saddam Hussein of Iraq had developed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, in violation of resolutions passed by the United Nations. Reports used by the Bush administration to initiate the Iraq War. However, Iraq had no WMDs that could be found. Following the collapse of Saddam's regime, Cheney's former company Halliburton secured lucrative reconstruction contracts from the US government, raising the specter of favoritism and possible wrongdoing, allegations that damaged Cheney's public reputation. This is only a brief summary of the false narratives US leadership used to justify their presence in Iraq. If you are interested in learning more, I put some further resources you can check out in the description below. However, even this small amount of background knowledge is essential. Without it, warfare risks being read as apolitical, when the very premise of this war was political deception. Chapter 3. Framing, Perspective, and Erasure. Whose lives count? At its core, Warfare is a film that co-director Ray Mendoza wanted to create in order to help his friend and comrade Elliot Miller understand what happened during a 2006 raid in Iraq, as Miller was paralyzed during the event and has no memory of it. This aim is undeniably noble, and I do respect that Mendoza resisted any attempt to glorify the raid or alter details beyond his own recollection. The film's stripped-down, memory-based approach lends it a visceral realism that succeeds in representing just how horrifying and ultimately ineffective war is. The SEALs' failure to accomplish anything meaningful in the film is striking. They invade a civilian home, suffer devastating and permanent injuries, call for backup, and eventually withdraw, having achieved nothing. The return to quiet, with birds chirping and civilians emerging from their homes as the tanks pull away, is haunting. It underscores the futility of what just unfolded. Mutual destruction with no clear purpose. The house that the SEALs occupy, destroy, and then abandon without a second thought becomes a striking symbol, a microcosm of Iraq itself. In this sense, it is both satisfying and deeply tragic to see the Iraqi family, along with their neighbors, reclaim their home after the Americans leave. It's a subtle yet poignant reminder of the irreparable damage left in the wake of occupation and of the resilience required to rebuild from it. Yet, the anti-war message that emerges from this story is undermined by the film's framing. While the plot gestures toward Iraqi suffering and futility, Garland's directorial choices repeatedly center the American perspective and obscure the Iraqi one. This is where my primary criticism of the film lies. Not with Mendoza, but with Alex Garland, the film's co-director and writer. Garland enabled Mendoza to recreate these events in painstaking detail, but then released the film with almost no narrative framing or contextual structure surrounding it, and seemingly no aim regarding what he wanted to achieve beyond telling Mendoza's story. In a Reddit Ask Me Anything thread, Garland stated, "This film wasn't about my thoughts or experiences. It was about the people involved." Despite the film's lack of structure and voice, the few framing choices that Garland does end up making are quite revealing. Warfare makes deliberate choices about what to show and what to obscure. The only soldier killed in action in the entire film is the Iraqi translator. His mangled body is shown on screen multiple times, yet his death receives no acknowledgement beyond these graphic images. The narrative framing forces viewers to move past the death of this unnamed man who died after being used as bait by the American SEALs, and instead immerses us in a perspective that centers the pain of the American soldiers. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout the film. In every combat scene, the camera focuses solely on the SEALs, firing into the distance at faceless enemies we never actually see. Despite hearing thousands of gunshots over the film's 90-minute runtime, we never witness the impact on those being shot at. Perhaps this lack of perspective shift was meant to reflect the SEALs' own disconnection from the lives they were taking. However, Garland himself explained in Rolling Stone that the choice stemmed from his personal interest in accuracy. One of the things that interested me personally was that when people are involved in combat, you don't necessarily get a clear sight of the people you're fighting with. You very briefly glimpse them or don't see them at all. And that seemed to me a thing that was often missing from cinematic representations of combat, and that was actually something I was quite keen that the film would represent. Unfortunately, this framing choice seems to come more from Garland's interest in producing an extremely accurate recreation of combat, rather than to highlight the way that the SEALs had to disconnect from the humanity of the Iraqi civilians in order to survive in the American military. The film's closing montage solidifies this imbalance in perspective. After the final scene, real photos of the SEALs appear beside their on-screen counterparts, followed by a dedication to Elliot Miller and a thank you to the infantry regiment that supported the SEALs. Garland has stated that his intent with the sequence was to anchor the film in reality, reminding viewers that what they had seen was a recreation of actual events. What's striking, though, is how much emphasis Garland places on this particular context, given how much other historical and political context he omits throughout the film. After 90 minutes of relentless horror, this sudden tribute undermines the film's anti-war messaging that had naturally emerged, as it feels like an emotional homage to the troops. The effect is further complicated by the fact that 12 of the 18 SEALs chose to have their faces blurred, signaling their refusal to be associated with the film. Even those with only a surface-level understanding of the Iraq War likely recognize why some individuals would want to distance themselves from the actions of certain American troops in the early 2000s. Yet, this is the context that Garland prioritized providing to his audience. Finally, after the photo montage, there's the most troubling transition of all, a cut from a photo of the Iraqi civilians whose home was raided directly into a photo of the cast and a few of the SEALs flipping off the camera. If the preceding montage didn't already raise ethical concerns, this transition feels indefensible. This editing choice is not only in poor taste, but also fundamentally at odds with the messaging and tone of the entire rest of the film. It almost feels as if the dissonance is intentional, like the film is accidentally representing Western apathy towards suffering that we are taught is inevitable instead of questioning or critiquing it. All of these framing choices could be interpreted as satirical, a critique of the SEALs' callousness and the way Iraqi bodies were reduced to collateral damage. However, given the SEALs' direct involvement in production, their detailed honoring in the final montage, and even the thank you extended to an infantry unit in the closing credits, it's difficult to believe these were entirely ironic, deliberate, directorial choices. It seems more likely that the anguish of the American soldiers was simply viewed as more cinematically compelling than the suffering of the Iraqis within the film. The lack of respect shown to the only man killed in action in the whole film left me with the sense that the filmmakers too were disconnected from Iraqi suffering. Perhaps inevitably, given how closely the film aligns with the perspective of American veterans. The disconnect becomes clearest in Garland's broader framing. He chose to zoom in on a single raid on a single day within the Iraq War. Despite Garland's insistence that this choice allowed him to produce a more realistic portrayal of war, I agree with Peter Beaumont of The Guardian when he writes, "Proximity to violence does not necessarily add value or clarity of meaning. In fact, the narrow scope is precisely what makes the SEALs appear courageous. Viewers are never given enough context to understand what they are doing or why they are doing it. Stripped of wider context, the film shifts into a survival thriller. Once the IED goes off, the SEALs go from soldiers in control to desperate men fighting to escape as Iraqi forces attack from all sides. Therefore, choosing this particular event to depict on screen and stretching it across the film's entire runtime is an intentional framing choice that allows the SEALs to be portrayed in a way that highlights their courage, brotherhood, and resilience, while glossing over the ethical and political dimensions of their actions. Imagine how different this film would be had Garland chosen to depict an event where the SEALs emerged victorious rather than overwhelmed, and then consider why that film probably wouldn't have been made." Chapter 4, Audience, Responsibility and Media Literacy. In Garland's own words, "Civilians don't go to war, the military go to war. But civilians make the decisions to go to war. They make the policies, and they also elect the politicians that make the policy. War is about as serious as things get on this planet, and so it's incumbent on civilians to understand what those wars are." In principle, I agree with Garland. Civilians should understand the true cost of war through its inefficiency, its horror, and its impact. But I think that this argument would have been more effective if warfare depicted a conflict that the American public largely supported. Even among veterans, the dominant view is that the Iraq War was not worth fighting. Had Garland framed and marketed Warfare clearly as an anti-war film, he wouldn't have even been pushing against mainstream public sentiment, just aligning with it. However, it is important to acknowledge that American support for the Iraq invasion was quite high in 2002. But that support was primarily driven by post-9/11 fear and deliberate misinformation from the Bush administration. American public support eroded steadily as the war dragged on. But I do wholeheartedly believe that Americans should be held accountable for the electoral decisions they made that led to the Iraq War, especially since 48% of Republicans and 30% of Democrats polled in 2018 still state that the U.S. mostly succeeded in achieving its goals in Iraq. Garland's idea that civilians make the decisions to go to war definitely carries some truth. But in a representative democracy shaped by misinformation and propaganda, that blame can't be laid so squarely on the public. More importantly, this framing glosses over the voluntary nature of the Iraq War's military involvement. This wasn't Vietnam. There was no draft. While the ultimate blame lies with political leadership, it's still worth acknowledging that U.S. soldiers voluntarily enlisted, even if many were drawn in by aggressive recruiting that targets young, poor, and marginalized communities. That exploitation is a story worth telling. Unfortunately, Warfare doesn't explore that dynamic. Beyond casting young actors, the film says little about who these soldiers are, why they ended up in the military, or how the military-industrial complex shaped their choices. Garland avoids these questions because he deliberately chose to focus on a single event in isolation, severed from broader cultural and historical context. Throughout the Warfare press tour, Garland consistently shut down conversations regarding propaganda and the film's lack of historical context. He has insisted that adding context would be infantilizing to viewers and argued that it's not his job to educate people. On multiple occasions, he has emphasized that he was simply trying to reproduce a veteran's memory unfiltered and raw. He leaves any further interpretation up to the audience. Garland has even argued that this infantilization used to be the role of the studios.
And it used to be the case that you had to smuggle things past studios. The studios felt that they were the gatekeepers of what audiences could or could not understand. And that, the sort of gatekeeping aspect of that seems to have migrated away from the studios to other quarters. They are basically saying, I think people are too dumb to figure this out. This other version to me is just incredibly patronizing and incredibly infantilizing of audiences. We present something, we believe we're offering it up to adults and they can figure out what they think.
Ironically, for someone so concerned with not patronizing viewers, Garland seems unwilling to engage seriously with thoughtful critique about Warfare. Surely, someone who doesn't want to patronize his audience would be open to critical discussion and analysis of his film, if even to prove that his film isn't meant to be propaganda and is open to interpretation and opinion. Take, for example, a Reddit Ask Me Anything where a user asks this detailed question. What's the balance in a movie like this between showing the story of the stars while not wanting to make another American war propaganda film, especially as history is not on the side of the invasion? How do you portray the misled invading force and a people defending their country without coming across as advocating either side? Also, what do you think of the following quote?
Because not only will America come to your country and kill all your people, but what's worse, I think, is that they'll come back 20 years later and make a movie about how killing your people made the soldiers feel sad. Oh, boo.
Garland's entire response to this question was, I haven't heard that quote before or seen it endlessly repeated. I appreciate its lack of glibness. Thank God studios don't infantilize and patronize audiences anymore, so now Alex Garland can. He ignored the actual question in a Reddit Ask Me Anything, and in doing so dodged a meaningful opportunity to explain how he navigated the nuance of making a war film. Considering how often Garland has stated that it is up to viewers to interpret the film's events based on their own knowledge, it's interesting how this viewer's interpretation of the film is dismissed so readily by Garland. Perhaps Garland doesn't feel confident enough in his ability to break down the quote and what exactly about it isn't true. If he is able to confidently label Boyle's quote as glib, I can confidently say the same about his response to this question. In another interview, when asked about the film's lack of context, Garland replied,
I know some people require context. I think, well, the context is fucking history, isn't it? And if you don't know about the Iraq War, if you require someone to tell you about the Iraq War, it may be incumbent on you to find something out about the Iraq War and how you feel about it personally. This film is just attempting to try to give an unfiltered account of a veteran's experience and also then a group of other people. That's its only intention, but then you have to decide what you make of that.
I find this stance disingenuous when there is so much misinformation surrounding international affairs and how we contribute to them within the Western world. Many of us, particularly younger audiences, were never properly educated about the Iraq War in school. Even within the American education system, the brief lessons most Americans receive on the Iraq War is grouped within the lesson on 9/11 and the Patriot Act. From a young age, Americans are taught that the Iraq War was an inevitable consequence of the September 11th attacks, and that the destruction caused by it was merely a necessary symptom of the war on terror. There is a reason that American school curriculums do not include information about the human rights violations and war crimes that occurred at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. As someone who was 3 years old when Dick Cheney and George W. Bush decided to invade Iraq, I literally learned about Cheney's involvement in the war from a Gabriel Gundaker vine.
When your dog eats Dick Cheney made money off the Iraq War.
Unfortunately, the reality is that many Americans' baseline knowledge of history is shaped by a biased, washed-down perspective and American media that reinforces this narrow-minded view of global events. I do want to clarify that I do believe that individuals have some responsibility to seek truth, especially in the age of the internet. But I'm sure that for some people, films such as Warfare are their attempt at learning more about the Iraq War, especially for those of us who weren't even conscious when these events were occurring. If we grew up not understanding the conflict due to its complexity, and see a film marketed as entirely based on memory of a historical event, would it be unreasonable to expect an opportunity to learn something from it? For many younger audiences that this film knowingly attractive with its cast, Warfare may be their first and possibly only encounter with the Iraq War on screen. That carries weight. Kit Connor's sitting next to him in this clip, probably shitting his pants because he wasn't even born when this conflict began, and maybe thought he would learn something about the Iraq War by making a film entirely about it with Iraq veterans, but no. Garland needs you to do your proper research before watching his film. You thought he was the expert? No, you're meant to be. Why? I don't know, I guess because you wanted to watch a movie about it. Consider this featured IMDb review. Watching this, my respect for our military deepened tenfold. The courage it takes to step into such situations is beyond comprehension, and the professionalism of the operators is portrayed with remarkable authenticity. This film didn't just entertain, it inspired me to be a better leader, a better friend. This interpretation of the film isn't entirely ludicrous. It's a somewhat logical symptom of the film's narrow focus on brotherhood, bravery, and survival, devoid of the reasons these men were in Iraq in the first place. While viewing this film, it's feasible to forget that these men voluntarily conscripted themselves to conduct direct action warfare. Without critical framing, Warfare can easily be seen as a heroic war story. In my opinion, that's not on the audience, that's on the filmmaker. Garland has dismissed criticism of Warfare by insisting that any misunderstanding of the film reflects the audience's prejudice rather than any failure of his own. When I see the way people misunderstand it, I can see their own prejudices. To insist that any misinterpretation lies entirely with the audience is a cop-out that takes all responsibility away from creators. All art frames, selects, and omits, and pretending otherwise is its own distortion. And Garland is not an indie filmmaker telling a small-scale story for a niche audience. Warfare is a high-profile A24 release, marketed heavily to young viewers through its cast. Its reach extends far beyond the veterans who wanted to see their story on screen. Perhaps due to his English nationality, Garland may not fully grasp how deeply American nationalism blinds so many Americans to the truths of our military's foreign policy. But you cannot blame audiences for lacking media literacy when your film refuses to challenge their worldview. As Justin Shen puts it, to make a film is to adopt a perspective, an inherently political act. Garland and Mendoza did not forget this, surely, despite their claims in the press. Yes, media literacy is lacking, but how is anyone supposed to develop media literacy if the media they consume refuses to challenge dominant narratives? We can't keep putting the entire burden on the audience. Not everyone watching this film is a politically engaged academic. Most people aren't. That's not a moral failing, it's a reality, which is why creators, especially when dealing with subjects as consequential as war, carry responsibility for how their work shapes cultural memory. Garland chose to create a film based on, and in turn profit from, the Iraq War, an event that killed approximately 200,000 Iraqi civilians, and that the US spent nearly $1 trillion on. That comes with the responsibility. At the least, perhaps this film challenged the perspective of viewers who idealize war to be exciting, or people who see veterans as heroes instead of real flawed humans. But I struggle to see the wider purpose of warfare beyond this. Ray Mendoza states that he made the film for veterans in order to create the most accurate depiction of combat to date. Is that enough? It seems to be for him. Perhaps I have too high of expectations regarding the complexity of art, but I believe that media shapes modern thought and culture as much as politics does. I believe that people who create art about history have a responsibility to provide context and framing for the narratives they present. Because it is a narrative, no matter how much Garland insists he is simply retelling a true story exactly as it happened. The act of filmmaking still involves choices, what to include, what to leave out, and how to frame the events within the structure of a film. If Garland is unwilling to take responsibility for the impact of the historical media he creates, then perhaps he should just stick to fiction, or at least to history with lower stakes than international warfare. Chapter 5: American Veteran Culture. Garland has stated, "I would say it's not possible to show war in any way that resembles what it really is in terms of its brutality and violence and emptiness without it being anti-war." Yet, to counterbalance the anti-war messaging that Garland acknowledges naturally emerged in his film, he seems to have felt compelled to repay the veterans involved for his exploitation of their story, especially Elliot Miller, by paying homage to them in the film's final sequence and dedication. As Mendoza emphasized, this film was ultimately intended for veterans. Garland himself acknowledged a shift in priorities during production. The responsibility stopped being about audiences or budget or anything, Garland says. It was the lived experience and incredible honesty, it's almost generosity, I'm not sure what the right word is, of Ray, his colleagues, and whoever we spoke to. It all became about responsibility to that. There was something bigger at stake. At some point, he stepped back from his role as director and became, in his words, a facilitator for Mendoza's story. Garland's commitment to faithfully recreating events rather than interpreting them produces a project that resists critique by presenting itself as a neutral reflection of memory. In doing so, he sidesteps the responsibilities inherent in depicting a story of this magnitude. This dynamic makes warfare frustrating to engage with critically. As critic Justin Shen notes, any attempt at critique or engagement with it pings off its stark surfaces. Everything has already been settled, underlined, and self-consciously presented. It's been designed to reflect the audience's views back at them rather than really make a cohesive point itself. Garland's reluctance to take a clear stance reduces the film to the vague, recycled message that war is hell. Even in interviews, he carefully avoids discussing the Iraq War or conflict more broadly. For example, Den of Geek wrote, "There are deep, trenchant lessons about the Iraq War to be found in warfare, but Garland doesn't feel an obligation to spell them out. I have probably learned more over the process of making this film than any other film I've ever been involved in," Garland says. Are the lessons signposted? No, because I don't want to be infantilized. I assume that other people don't want to be infantilized. I believe that American veteran culture likely permeated the set in ways that shut down critical conversations before they could even begin. I feel this tension myself. Imagining a former SEAL watching this video fills me with anxiety. There's a fear of being perceived as an ignorant civilian, unfairly judging those who have served in the military. I wonder how much of that discomfort stems from the American ideals we're raised with, the ones that teach us to honor our troops and thank them for their sacrifice, versus how much comes from the knowledge that our country often exploits service members by using up their bodies and minds, only to discard them once they're no longer deemed useful. It's incredibly difficult to have honest dialogue about war and veterans in American culture because we're all caught in a deep ideological tension. On one hand, we're taught from birth that we need the military to protect us from vague, faceless threats. On the other, many veterans who internalized that belief and chose to serve are now left clinging to the idea that their service had meaning, because without that meaning, they are left with nothing but loss. This emotional and psychological cost makes it difficult for many veterans and civilians alike to engage in critical reflection. We must be critical of the American military as an institution and the politicians who create the circumstances that lead to war. But this does not require uncritical reverence for all veterans. When individuals voluntarily join a corrupt institution, especially one with a long history of violence and exploitation, I believe they too bear some responsibility. The cultural expectation that we must place all veterans on a pedestal not only simplifies a deeply complex issue, but also stifles any meaningful conversation about the military's role in American life. Even the actors in warfare appeared hesitant to engage with these issues during the press tour. Joseph Quinn, in particular, echoed Garland's tendency to talk around the subject under the guise of respecting the audience's intelligence. In an Entertainment Weekly interview, he stated,
"Personally, I mean, we'll all take our own things away from this. I personally came out of it with some pretty strong opinions about conflict and war, and I'm sure we all did, but it was very specific."
It's hard not to laugh at that clip because it seems like he's about to come out and make some groundbreaking, brave statement, but then he doesn't really say anything at all besides that he has personal opinions. Yes, King. So brave. This refusal to take a moral stance on the Iraq War 20 years later feels jarring, given that most Americans today, not to mention international audiences, broadly recognize the invasion of Iraq as both horrific and unjustified. This reluctance to engage in critical discussion seems driven by a desire to appeal to as wide of an audience as possible. By remaining vague, the film allows for multiple, even contradictory, interpretations. Anti-war viewers can praise Garland for exposing the brutal indifference of American veterans, while pro-military audiences can celebrate the film's realistic portrayal of American heroism. In attempting to satisfy both camps, however, the film risks saying nothing at all, flattening moral complexity in favor of political neutrality disguised as nuance. Conclusion: Warfare's hollow anti-war stance. In the end, Warfare doesn't challenge viewers to reconsider their beliefs about the Iraq War so much as it leaves them with a vague sense of horror, detached from historical or political understanding. The film succeeds at showing what combat feels like, but it does little beyond reiterating the familiar truism that war is hell. A sentiment so uncontroversial that even U.S. politicians who actively fund wars endorse it.
And war is hell, and that is true.
So was this film really a necessary representation of war in this day and age? I'm not a huge fan of war films, but even I've seen enough in my lifetime that have already shown me how truly hellish war is. I'm not sure how many films within this genre can communicate this same sentiment without adding much new to the conversation. To be fair, I'm not sure that Garland set out to represent much more beyond this sentiment. In an interview with Sky News, he makes the following statement about the film.
It's anti-war in as much as it would say it is better if war does not happen. And that is about the most obvious statement about life on this planet that one could make. It would be better if Gaza had not been flattened. It would be better. It would be better if Ukraine was not invaded. It would be better if all people's problems could be solved via dialogue and not threat or violence.
In the same interview, he also insists, "I don't think it's possible to make a statement about what war is really like without it being implicitly anti-war, in as much as it would be better if this thing did not happen. But that's not the same as saying it should never happen. There are circumstances in which war is required." This inconsistent belief mirrors the contradiction at the heart of Warfare, a plot that depicts the futility of war paired with a final sequence that reveres American veterans. Warfare only functions as an anti-war film in the limited sense that its realism inevitably exposes the inherent horror and meaninglessness of war. Garland's insistence that war can be both tragic and sometimes necessary doesn't just undermine the film's anti-war potential, it plays directly into military propaganda that justifies war as an unfortunate necessity. Worst of all, to portray American intervention in the Middle East as anything other than unnecessary, horrific war crimes is dangerous, especially while the US bankrolls new atrocities in the region. This ambivalence extends to Garland's insistence that warfare represents a universal experience of conflict. In a Q&A, he suggests the following.
Yes, it's set in the Mahdi in Iraq, but I think you could perfectly reasonably say that the dynamics you see playing out here would have existed 2,500 years ago with a group of Greek soldiers under attack and being overwhelmed, or Gaza, Ukraine, Second World War, First World War, Crimean War, you name it, any war. So there's something sort of semi-universal where it speaks to a broader truth than the truth you see here.
But this universal framing flattens everything. By stripping the Iraq War of its political and cultural specificity, he reduces invasions, occupations, and even genocides to interchangeable tragedies. I think the sentiment that the film represents a universal experience is also very telling, because it might explain why Garland was so intent on stripping away historical and cultural context within the film in order to reduce the Iraq War to a universal tragedy. Try to imagine an apolitical war film told from the Iraqi perspective and how that film would be received in the US. It's telling that only certain viewpoints, those aligned with American or Western military interests, are granted the illusion of universality or neutrality. And that brings us to the larger problem with these war as hell films. They often depict the consequences of war, but usually only for American or Western troops. They gesture towards anti-war sentiment by showing that war is miserable, without ever interrogating the injustice or imperialism that drives these conflicts. The implicit message is not that war is wrong, but that it's unfortunate we have to fight it. These films may not really be critiquing the fact that we are killing civilians, but instead that our soldiers are traumatized from doing it. This doesn't promote true anti-war ideology, and I fear it may align with an ideology that likes the idea of bombs being remotely dropped on the other side of the world. In a country already steeped in cognitive dissonance about its global violence, this kind of storytelling reinforces the belief that the worst thing about war is that we have to do it, not that others have to endure it. These films mourn the trauma we inflict on ourselves, not the far greater trauma we inflict on others. That distinction matters. I fear that this kind of film risks reinforcing the idea that the worst part of war is the fact that we have to witness it, not that it's happening at all.